So welcome to the third of three conferences on praying with the Spanish mystics. My name is Carl McColman, and this three-conference retreat is sponsored by Holy Cross Monastery of West Park, New York. After Ignatius of Loyola and Teresa of Ávila, today's conference will focus on St. John of the Cross. And forgive me for injecting just a brief little commercial into the slides, but I do want to thank those of you who are able to support not only my ministry, but especially the ministry of Holy Cross Monastery through your generous donation. As you can see, the link to make a donation is holycrossmonastery.com/donate. And the monks ask that you write Spanish Mystics Retreat in the memo field so that they are able to keep track of where the donations are coming from. So once again, thank you very much. And now let's move along with the retreat. So we'll open with a prayer from our saint of the day, St. John of the Cross. So I invite you to take a deep breath and enter into your interior silence. And let me just share these words and just allow them to wash over you. O abyss of delights, by your purity, O divine wisdom, many things are beheld in you through one. For you are the deposit of the Father's treasures, the splendor of the eternal light, the unspotted mirror and image of God's goodness. Awaken and enlighten us, our Lord, that we might know and love the blessings which you ever propose to us, and that we might understand that you have moved to bestow favors on us and have remembered us. Amen. So who is St. John of the Cross? He was born in 1542, so he's the youngest of the three mystics we are exploring in this retreat. Remember, Ignatius was 1491, Teresa was 1515, so he's 27 years younger than Teresa, who eventually became his mentor. He dies on December 14th, 1591, so he takes us almost to the end of the 16th century. Of course, December 14th is now his feast day. He was canonized as a saint on the Catholic calendar in 1726. And then he was named a doctor of the church on the 200th anniversary of his canonization in the year 1926. And he is known as the mystical doctor. And I would say that if it makes sense, I mean, mysticism kind of takes us away from evaluation anyways. But if we were to give mystics a rating, quote unquote, John, along with Teresa, along with Julian of Norwich, certainly qualifies as what we could call an A-list mystic, certainly one of the handful of contemplatives in the tradition, certainly in the Western Christian tradition, that really is worth getting to know. Having said that, his writing, especially his prose, can be very difficult. Hopefully we'll find a few clues today as to how to approach his challenging but luminously beautiful wisdom. So from the Oxford Dictionary of the Christian Church, together with St. Teresa, St. John of the Cross brought into being a uniquely comprehensive and analytical account of the successive stages of purgation, illumination, and union through which the soul passes in the course of its approach to God. The accounts of this progress given by these two Carmelites are commonly regarded as possessing unique authority. So let me just focus on these three words: purgation, illumination, and union. In Greek, you have catharsis, theoria, and theosis. So this idea that the spiritual life involves a kind of interior healing or interior cleansing involves, well, what happens once you clean a window, the light shines through. Involves kind of this reception of the divine presence in a clearer way than before. But then that leads on to what certainly the Greek fathers or elders of the church describe as theosis, or literally to be participators or partakers of the divine nature. So this threefold model goes all the way back to the early centuries, in in Alexandria, Egypt, Origin of Alexandria, kind of, I think, late second, maybe early third century, uh, father of the church, uses this model, actually basing it on three books in the Bible. On I think it was Proverbs was purgation, Ecclesiastes was illumination, and the Song of Songs was union. And so underline the Song of Songs, as we'll be coming back to that. So this is an ancient model of the spiritual life. And many teachers over the centuries have kind of expanded on this model, John of the Cross being one of them. So everything that we look at today will be looking at how his ideas fit into this basic idea of cleansing, enlightenment, and then divine union as the basic dynamic of the spiritual life. So John's father dies when he is just a small child, leaving his mother destitute. This is significant because John's father comes from a family of means, a family that had some wealth, and I think may have even been nobility, whereas his mother was below their class. She was just a, quote, working class woman. He married for love, and his family actually disowned him. And the tragic part of this story is that after his death, the mother turned to the family, hoping that they would help to support the two children. But the family rebuffed her. They really just wanted nothing to do with her, and even nothing to do with the children. So that set the stage for John having a very poor, really an impoverished childhood. But also it gave him a clear sense of the sacrifices that one can make in the interest of love. And so this becomes an enduring theme of John's own work, that for love, no sacrifice is too great. And for divine love, absolutely no sacrifice is too great. John is ultimately educated by the Jesuits. Remember, Ignatius, is only a couple of generations ahead of John. So the Jesuits are still very young as an order in the church. But remember, Ignatius dies in 1565. So Ignatius is still alive, although he's living in Rome at this point. But the order grew rapidly during Ignatius's lifetime. So there was a Jesuit presence in Spain, and the Jesuits provided John with his education. But then after completing his education, he enters the Carmelites. Now, the Carmelite order, of course, is the same order that St. Teresa of Ávila was a member of. Later figures that you may be familiar with, Brother Lawrence of the Resurrection, St. Teresa of Lisieux in the 19th century, and Edith Stein in the 20th century. So the Carmelites have been quite the petri dish for the growth of Christian spirituality, Christian mysticism. And as we mentioned yesterday, Teresa spearheaded a reform in the Carmelite movement. That is something that John is very intimately a part of. He meets Teresa not long after entering the Carmelites, and he's ordained a priest in 1567, and it's about that time that he meets her, and he's already having some questions about his vocation as a Carmelite, because he had the same reaction that she did. He felt that the order was not really being authentic in terms of living up to its own ideals, and he was thinking about entering into a Carthusian monastery, so trading the life of a friar to the more austere life of a monk. Teresa, however, talks him out of this, and he joins her in the Carmelite reform, and actually establishes the first reform monastery for men, which he does the following year, 1568. But the reform was not without its opposition, and in the general chapter of the Carmelites in 1575, there was an incredible backlash against the reform, and this led to actually John being I no other way to say it, kidnapped and imprisoned by Carmelite monks who were hostile to the reform. He is kidnapped and imprisoned in a monastery, in a Carmelite friary in Toledo, Spain, not Toledo, Ohio, Toledo, Spain. And he stays there for almost 9 months. He is treated terribly. He is beaten frequently. He is kept in solitary confinement. It was just a horrific ordeal. And the saving grace was that his jailer befriended him. John just apparently was able to win over his confidence. And the jailer actually provided him with pen and paper, and John begins writing poetry during his imprisonment. So really the beginning of John's vocation as a writer, first as a poet, but then as a mystical theologian, really emerges out of that 9-month period in which he is actually imprisoned by his fellow brothers in the Carmelite order. Once he escapes, he makes his way to a Carmelite convent that is friendly to the reform, or part of the reform. The nuns take him in. They nurse him back to health because his health was compromised during his imprisonment. And then at this point, he's able to leave Toledo. He's able to move freely within the order. And by 1580, so about 2 years later, the old order Carmelites and the Reformed or the Discalced Carmelites actually separate into 2 orders. And at that point, John and Teresa are able to continue their work without opposition. Of course, Teresa dies in 1582. John dies 9 years later at the age of 49, if I'm pronouncing this right, erysipelas, of an infection that proved to be fatal for him. This image that you see here is a drawing, a very celebrated drawing that John did of the crucifix. He was trying to look at the crucifixion from kind of a God's eye point of view, to look at it from above, as it were, looking down upon the suffering Christ. And those of you who are fans of 20th century art will recognize that it was the inspiration for Salvador Dali's Christ of St. John of the Cross, which is part of the permanent collection of the Kelvin Grove Gallery in Glasgow. I was in Glasgow last year. They've done a wonderful job. They have a gallery in which this is the only painting on display in that gallery, a small gallery. It's like a tiny little chapel in the middle of the art gallery. And of course, I sat there for about a half an hour. I was just so stricken by the beauty of the painting, and then of course its ties to St. John of the Cross. So John's writings, he basically left us with 4 major prose works. Now the thing to know about this is that he was a poet first, and his poems, The Spiritual Canticle and The Dark Night, you'll also see it titled One Dark Night, are actually considered to be masterpieces of Spanish poetry. So John is considered a major poet in the Spanish literary canon. But it's out of his poetry, which of course began while he was imprisoned, that he then writes his mystical theology. And essentially each of the 4 books that you see here, his 4 major books, are all commentaries on one of 3 poems of his. So you have the Spiritual Canticle, which is the commentary on the poem, the Spiritual Canticle, which is essentially John's kind of retelling of the Song of Songs. It's almost like a Spanish vernacular paraphrase revisioning of the Song of Songs. And then the work that he is the best known, his best known work is The Dark Night of the Soul, which that and its companion volume, The Ascent of Mount Carmel, are commentaries on the poem One Dark Night, or The Dark Night. And then finally, his last work, and in many ways kind of his underappreciated masterpiece, is Living Flame of Love, based on a very short poem called Living Flame of Love, and is considered to be probably his most mature statement on the spiritual life as responding to divine love. Just other writings of his, again, the poetry, it's not a huge body of work, less than 2,500 verses, but oh, what a sublime body of work it is. Again, with those 2 poems in particular, considered to be masterworks, not just in Christian literature, but in Spanish literature as well. His sayings of light and love, actually a collection of 175 aphorisms, short sayings that again are a little bit more accessible than his theological commentary. Just various shorter works, mostly written for his religious brothers and sisters. And we only have about 33 letters or fragments of letters that survived. And scholars think that that's a sign of just how controversial he was in his lifetime. People may have actually burned his letters because it may have been dangerous for them to have his letters in their possession, particularly at a time when the order was so controversial. A lovely little soundbite from John: the ultimate reason for everything is love. And I would invite you to hold that thought as we explore his poetry and as we explore this concept of the dark night of the soul, that everything emerges out of love and that the entirety of the spiritual life is a response to love, a response to divine love. So John really is focused on union with God. He doesn't beat around the bush. That is really the heart of what he is after, as both as a poet and as a theologian or a spiritual writer. Nothing less than union with God will satisfy the human heart. And he sees really all of the drama and the conflict of life as essentially this dynamic between God's desire for us, our desire for God, but also the ways in which we resist God through attachments, through sin, through uh, being caught up with the our love for earthly or worldly or temporal things. So because of our limitations in sin, we need to be cleansed. That's that purgation, that first stage of the spiritual journey. There needs to be that catharsis, that cleansing or that healing as kind of a beginning stage of a serious spiritual life. So John uses two terms. He talks about a dark night of the senses, and he talks about a dark night of the spirit or dark night of the soul. He also talks about them in terms of an active or a passive quality. So this phrase, dark night of the spirit, dark night of the soul, and then dark night of the senses, is fairly challenging. And I'll be honest with you, in all my research, I never found a commentator who really gave just a straightforward explanation of them. So they're it's again, you got to read him as a poet, that there's a poetic quality to these. And I've created a little diagram, we'll get to it in a few slides, to kind of give you my take on how we can understand this terminology. But it all basically implies that there are stages or phases or dimensions of growth that we pass through on our journey towards more fully giving ourselves to the call to divine love. Purification, you'll also hear the more archaic word of purgation. They're scary words. Again, maybe the Greek word catharsis is a little bit easier to wrap our heads around. But really, it's this idea of letting go of anything that stands in the way of this supreme goal, this supreme beatitude of union with God. Now, John doesn't, at least nowhere in my knowledge of John, having read through his works, I've never found a place where John sits down and gives kind of a nitty gritty, this is how you pray. His writing is more descriptive rather than proscriptive. He really invites us to reflect on the stages of the spiritual life, the stages of the spiritual journey, and encourages us to trust even the challenges that we encounter, to trust suffering, to trust the experience of God's absence or God seeming hidden or far away, to trust that sense of the darkness of faith where we may have to struggle with feelings of doubt or feelings of uncertainty as we strive to remain faithful to our spiritual calling. So here comes an author named James W. Kin. And actually my diagram, I probably drew more from Kin than from any other commentator in terms of trying to make sense of the dark night. And he writes, what John of the Cross means is that the memory, the understanding, and the will, really that, the dimensions of human consciousness are dark and empty. So that just as an actual night leaves the eyes dark and unable to function kind of on a physical level, dark contemplation leaves our kind of consciousness faculties, our memory, our ability to reason, our intellect, our will, our ability to make choices, dark and unable to function. So it's really this idea of moving into, to borrow a metaphor from the English tradition, moving radically into the cloud of unknowing, radically into that darkness where certainty or an ease of understanding may simply not be available to us. Okay, so here's my handy little chart on trying to make sense of the dark night. First, we've got the active night of the senses, and this is treated in the book Ascent of Mount Carmel, book 1. It says our efforts, that's the key here. Active means what we do, how we take initiative, to detach ourselves from anything in our lives that impedes or obstructs our relationship with God. Think about the reptiles in the interior castle. So the active night of the senses is when we get into the pest control business. It's when we get into trying to exterminate or get rid of the little creepy crawly things that are our attachments, our addictions, our compulsions, our sins, our willful rejection of love. Anything in our lives, whether it's of our own doing or just circumstances that we are struggling with, but anything in our lives that impede us from freely responding to the love of God. That process is what John would call the active night of the senses. Essentially, this is the purgative way. This is that process of catharsis. But then he talks about a passive night of the senses. And this, we turn to the book Dark Night of the Soul, the first section of that book. And here he's really talking more about what is going on with God. If the active night is what are we up to, the passive night is more about what is God up to. And the challenge here is that God seems hidden. God seems to no longer be speaking to us through our normal sensory or cognitive awareness. God seems far away, even when we meditate, even when we pray. And one of the things that John suggests is that this implies a need to move from traditional forms of meditation. Think about, the Ignatian form of meditation or the Teresian recollection that we looked at Tuesday and Wednesday. John's saying there comes a point where we have to begin to let those kind of more mainstream or ordinary forms of prayer aside and move more radically into the darkness of contemplation. But then this leads to this idea of the night of the spirit or the night of the soul. In the Ascent of Mount Carmel, books 2 and 3, John talks about how we are called to respond to this seeming absence of God. And he suggests that really the key is to embrace a prayer of just radical emptiness or radical silence, or again, to use the metaphor from the English tradition, radical unknowing. And to persevere in a prayer where the focus is less on images, less on meditation, and more on the simple gaze of love, even if what we're gazing into is the darkness of night. Of course, it implies a continual commitment to do what we can to let go of everything that stands in our way of freely responding to the love of God. And then finally, the passive night of the spirit, which takes us to the second book of the Dark Night of the Soul. Here we, and if anybody who has kind of a veteran experience of centering prayer or other forms of silent prayer will probably be able to relate to this. It's like I move into silent prayer and God just seems to be more absent than ever before. And what John suggests is that there comes a point where our prayer just brings us to radical poverty and powerlessness. The idea, of course, is that the only response to that is to go deeper into trust, to go deeper into simply persevering in the dark, praying our way through the unknowing, praying our way through the sense of divine absence. Notice I use the word radical 3 times in my definition here. Of course, the word radical comes from the Latin for to the root. So the idea here is that at this point, God is literally transforming us all the way down to the root of our spirit, to the root of our soul. And so it's happening. What is that prayer from Thomas Merton where he says, I believe you will lead me on the right road, though I may know nothing about it. I think Merton may have been alluding to this passive night of the spirit, this idea that God sometimes works on us below the threshold of our consciousness. And our job is to simply trust God, to love God, to continue to pray, even in silence, even in unknowing, even in darkness, and then to trust the one who we believe loves us through that. Now, you may be thinking this is all very philosophical, and it is. Uh, he was very much, John of the Cross was very much steeped in the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas, and this influences his writing. And to be perfectly candid, I think for many of us, here in the 21st century, unless we have a similar kind of grounding in medieval theology, reading John is not easygoing. It's challenging. And so the reality is that, this has been my experience and the experience of a number of people that I've known over the years, that John is just, he's hard to read. He's not you pick up Julian of Norwich or even Teresa of Ávila, and there are just delights on every page. There are challenges to reading them, but there are also delights. With John, sometimes the challenge seems to overwhelm the delights a bit more. But then the subject matter has something to do with this as well. Since John is zeroing in on how we suffer in our lives. We suffer because of our sins. We suffer because of things outside of our control. We experience affliction. And John is really looking at how the challenges of affliction and suffering can actually work on our spiritual lives. But let's be real, he's kind of a Debbie Downer. There's this kind of part of us that really has difficulty maybe just kind of hanging in there with the difficult subject matter that he writes about in his commentary. So what I want to do is I want to, without offering a lot of commentary myself, is I want to share some of John's poetry with you and really let John speak for himself. And my hope is that I can simply read the poetry. I'll allow some time for some silence. And I hope that you can approach this kind of in a spirit of Lectio Divina. Just let the words of the poetry wash over you. Just listen to what John has to say. See if any of the words really seem to resonate with your heart, with your soul, and if they seem to be kind of tugging at you in any particular way. So the first one is the Spiritual Canticle. I'm not going to read the entire poem because it is a very, very long poem, but I am going to share with you stanzas 13 through 19. The first 31 stanzas were written while he was imprisoned. So what I'm reading to you, of course, is an English translation of words that he originally wrote during his period of imprisonment. And remember, this is kind of his kind of paraphrase, if you will, or revisioning of the Song of Songs. So this is the voice of the bridegroom. Return, my dove. The wounded heart looms on the hill in the air of your flight and is refreshed. My beloved is the mountains, the solitary wooded valleys, the strange islands, the roaring torrents, the whisper of the amorous gales, the tranquil night at the approaches of the dawn, the silent music, the murmuring solitude, the supper which revives and enkindles love. Catch us the foxes, for our vineyard has flourished. While of roses we make a nosegay, and let no one appear on the hill. O violent north wind, cease. Come, south wind that awakens love. Blow through my garden, and let its odors flow, and the beloved shall feed among the flowers. O nymphs of Judea, while amid the flowers and the rose trees, the amber sends forth its perfume. Tarry in the suburbs and touch not our thresholds. Hide yourself, O my beloved. Turn your face to the mountains. Do not speak, but regard the companions of her who is traveling amidst strange islands. So you can hear echoes from the biblical Song of Songs, but certainly very much in John's own voice and John's own reimagining of that poem. And now probably John's best known poem. On a dark night, kindled in love with yearnings, oh, happy chance. I went forth without being observed, my house being now at rest. In darkness and secure, by the secret ladder, disguised, oh, happy chance. In darkness and in concealment, my house being now at rest. In the happy night, in secret, when none saw me, nor I beheld aught, without light or guide, save that which burned in my heart. This light guided me more surely than the light of noonday to the place where he, well I knew who, was awaiting me, a place where none appeared. O night that guided me, O night more lovely than the dawn, O night that joined beloved with lover, lover transformed in the beloved. Upon my flowery breast, kept holy for himself alone, there he stayed sleeping, and I caressed him. And the fanning of the cedars made a breeze. The breeze blew from the turret as I parted his locks. With his gentle hand, he wounded my neck and caused all my senses to be suspended. I remained lost in oblivion. My face I reclined on the beloved. All ceased, and I abandoned myself, leaving my cares forgotten among the lilies. And finally, the living flame of love. O living flame of love, that tenderly wounds my soul in its inmost depth. Since you do not elude, perfect your work, if it be your will. Break the web in this sweet encounter. O sweet burn, O delicious wound, O tender hand, O delicate touch, savoring of everlasting life, and paying the whole debt. In destroying death, you have changed it into life. O lamps of fire, in whose splendors the deep caverns of sense, obscure and dark, with exquisite brightness give light and heat together to their beloved. How gently and how lovingly you lay awake in my bosom, where alone you secretly dwell, and in your sweet breathing, full of grace and glory, how tenderly you fill me with your love. So in his book, The Ascent of Mount Carmel, John offers advice for when a person should begin to enter into silent prayer, contemplative prayer, as an alternative to more content-rich meditation. He suggests that the first sign that we're ready for contemplation is a recognition that meditative forms of prayer no longer satisfy our heart's hunger for God. We can try meditating on a gospel passage or Lectio Divina, or praying in an Ignatian manner, but we find that it just leaves us restless. The second sign is a willingness to let thoughts and feelings come and go without focusing on anything. So this idea that one becomes more comfortable with silence, understanding that the human mind and the human heart being what it is, our silent prayer is never purely silent. There will always be distracting thoughts and images and feelings and daydreams. But John says that to the extent that we are able to simply let those come and let those go, we can see that as a call to move more deeply into contemplation. And then finally, that we recognize in our heart just a simple desire to rest in loving awareness of God. So less of an emphasis on what God needs for us to do or what we need God to do. Not to say that there isn't a place of action in life, for life is action, but just an increasing openness and willingness and desire to simply rest. I think the verse at question here, of course, is be still and know. So John says we suffer because what we desire cannot be fulfilled on this side of eternity. Wayne Simsick's book, Seeking the Beloved, which is a wonderful introduction to John of the Cross, he says this is John's primary message. Our suffering will continue unless we seek union with God, because anything less than infinite love will never satisfy our heart's desire. If you're like me, when I read this passage, my mind goes straight to St. Augustine. You have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you. I just see an echo of that basic message here in this commentary on John. So what I'd like to do, let's see, oh good, we're doing good with time. What I'd like to do is invite us into more of a silent prayer experience. But what I'm going to do to guide us into this prayer is read a collection of sayings from John's collection of aphorisms called the Sayings of Light and Love. And again, if you're brand new to John, I think his poetry and the Sayings of Light and Love are the way to begin. They're very, very accessible, especially compared to the prose works. So hopefully the ones that I share with you now, that you will find them as invitations into your own prayer. So I invite you to find your comfortable spot. Feel free to close your eyes and take a break from the light in your computer screen. But if you want to follow along, of course, I will be projecting what I'm going to be reading to you on the slides so you can see them as well. All of these do come from the Sayings of Light and Love. So let's begin by taking just a few deep breaths and just letting go of whatever anxieties or distractions or things on the to-do list that can wait for another 45 minutes or so. Just let them go for now. And just seek to be present in that divine presence that Saint Benedict says we believe is everywhere. Trusting that God is present right here and right now in your heart. Enter within yourself and pray in the presence of your bridegroom who is ever present, loving you. Be interiorly detached from all things, and do not seek pleasure in any temporal thing. And your soul will concentrate on goods you do not know. The Father spoke one word, which was the Son. And this word is spoken always in eternal silence. And in silence must it be heard by the soul. Ignoring the imperfections of others, preserving silence, and a continual communion with God will eradicate great imperfections from the soul and make it the possessor of great virtues. What we need most in order to make progress is to be silent before this great God with our appetite and with our tongue. For the language God best hears is silent love. What God seeks, God being God by nature, is to make us gods through participation, just as fire converts all things to fire. So let's just take a few more moments for some silence. And I just invite you to rest, trusting in that divine presence that's in your heart, that loves you and seeks to transform you so that you truly can be the image and likeness of love yourself. So if you want to explore John further, probably the single best book to get is the most recent kind of omnibus edition of John's writings translated into English, published by the Institute for Carmelite Studies, uh, translated by Kavanaugh and Rodriguez. And it's in one big book. You can get it on the Kindle. So there are ebook versions available, or the hardback. I have the hardback. It's about $32, and I think the paperback is maybe 20 or 25. But you can find that again. Probably the monastery bookstore there at Holy Cross has it, or they can get it for you. But it's the Kavanaugh Rodriguez translation is very accessible. It's just a beautiful book and collects all of his work together. Once again, I cannot emphasize enough. Start with the poetry, then move to the sayings, and then if you want to go ahead and explore the prose, don't start with The Dark Night of the Soul. That's the book everybody knows with John, but it's actually one of his more difficult texts. So begin with either the Spiritual Canticle or the Living Flame of Love, where John is foregrounding divine love rather than foregrounding the suffering and afflictions that we can often experience on our spiritual life. Again, Mirabai Starr has translated The Dark Night. Her translations are wonderful, very, very accessible. So if you're ready to take that on, you might want to consider looking at her translation as well. As far as commentaries for John, there are a number of good ones. Once again, I think very highly of Ruth Burroughs, the English Carmelite nun. She has written a book. It's out of print, so it's kind of hard to find, but it's called Ascent to Love, which is a commentary on John. But one that's maybe a little bit easier to come across, I know it's on the Kindle, is Richard Hardy's John of the Cross, Man and Mystic, which does offer kind of a reading guide to John's work. And if you really want a devotional or spiritual approach, I really recommend Wayne Simsick's The Prayer Journey, Seeking the Beloved, The Prayer Journey of St. John of the Cross. But then the other book, gosh, if my mind is a sieve right now, but the title is The Practice of Contemplation According to John of the Cross. That's not bad either, but I would say Simsick's book is probably the most accessible. So those would be just a few to get you started. John, he is challenging, but there's also such a high theology of divine love and such a clear sense that our destiny, our vocation, our common vocation as human beings, just by virtue of our existence, is to be enfolded in that love and to literally become icons, manifestations of that love. So it's a beautiful theology that he offers us. So to close out the slides, I would like to offer a prayer from Saint Teresa of Ávila to kind of go back to her. Many of you will already know this prayer. It's kind of a classic. So I just felt like we really needed to include it. So please join with me just one more moment of intentional prayer as we listen to these words from Saint Teresa. Christ now has no body but yours. No hands, no feet on earth, but yours. Yours are the eyes through which he looks with compassion on this world. Yours are the feet with which he walks to do good. Yours are the hands through which he blesses all the world. Yours are the hands, yours are the feet, yours are the eyes, you are his body. Christ has no body now on earth but yours. Amen.